It's a couple of minutes after 10, so let's begin. Good morning to everyone, those who are watching on Zoom live, and also those who will be watching the recording later. It is a pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Dr. Leyla Isik. Her talk is titled The Neural Computations Underlying Human Social Interaction Recognition. Dr. Isik earned her PhD from MIT, after which she was a postdoctoral scholar at MIT and Harvard, and currently she is the Claire Booth Luce Assistant Professor of Cognitive Science at Johns Hopkins University. So her research interest is really in understanding the vast visual and social capacities of humans. You know, even with the recent advancements in AI, computer vision is far inferior to the human visual capabilities. And so she researches the human capacities and capabilities using a variety of tools: machine learning, neuroimaging, intracranial recordings, and behavioral analysis. So without further ado, Dr. Isik, the stage is yours. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me. One thing I wanted to say is I'm happy to be interrupted throughout the talk. So if you're on, feel free to chime in with questions at any point. Okay. So as humans, we use our vision for so much more than just recognizing objects or scenes. So in particular, we constantly watch people and what they're doing to try to figure out what we ourselves should be doing. So this is an example I was shown recently that I really liked. It's you're looking at an outdoor restaurant in Brazil where a bunch of diners are sitting, and you're going to see a CrossFit fitness class, a group of runners jog by the restaurant. And what happens is when the diners see all of these people running together, they get very alarmed, and because that's a strange thing to see. And then quickly they themselves all decide to leave and evacuate the restaurant. And so this is sort of a silly example, but I think nicely demonstrates how attuned we are to what other people are doing and how important it is for us to be able to recognize this. And so understanding this sort of social action recognition is a really key focus of our research. It's also something that infants and young children are attuned to from a very early age. And so just going to highlight a couple of studies I like. One recent study from Ashley Thomas and Rebecca Sachs showed that young children can tell whether another adult is, or whether somebody else is a close or distant relation based on whether you do actions that share saliva with them. So if you share a cup or kiss somebody, they're likely to be infants even know that they're likely to be a close relation. Whereas if you just touch your forehead and touch them, they don't make that same inference. So these are really subtle judgments that even infants can pick up on by watching other people's actions. We are also very good at recognizing this information even from simple visual displays. So some seminal work from Kylie Hamlin's lab showed that when they watch puppets doing displays like this, infants can tell if one puppet is helpful, like this triangle, or hindering, like this square, and then subsequently show a preference for playing with the triangle over the square. Interestingly, even other primates can do this. So even in displays like this, bonobos can tell apart helpers and hinderers. But despite the importance of these abilities and how ubiquitous and early developing they are, we still don't really understand the neural computations that support this. And also, I believe as a result, we still don't have AI models that are particularly good at this. Even the best models that do amazingly well at recognizing objects, captioning images, still show big deficits in their social recognition. And I think there's a couple of reasons for this. One, it's a difficult vision problem, right? So these social scenes are often dynamic and they're inherently relational because you have to track people relative to each other. But also, I just think it's been less of a focus for both the computer vision and cognitive neuroscience community than other problems like object recognition. And so the approach we try to take in our lab is to use the methods that have been successful in helping us understand visual object recognition to understand different parts of social vision. And so in particular, we use a combination of neuroimaging, human behavioral experiments, and computational modeling and critically try to combine all of these methods together by comparing them to each other. And so the focus of my talk today is going to be on how we recognize the social interactions between people. So whether two people are interacting, whether it's a positive or negative interaction. And in the first part of my talk, I'll just briefly tell you about a recent review article we wrote, a perspective piece where we argue that this can be approached as a visual problem, just like object recognition. And then I'll tell you about two different empirical studies looking at both the brain basis and computational models of this ability. All right, so we recently published an opinion piece in Trends in Cognitive Science where we argue that social interactions are actually recognized within the human visual system. So first, I want to explain what I mean by this. So by visual, in fact, I'm actually going to explain what I don't mean by this. So I'm not talking, when I say that something is done visually, I'm not saying it's just done by trivial low-level features, like two things are moving together, therefore they're interacting. The flip side of that is I'm also not saying that it's something we see and then process using very advanced cognitive thinking. Instead, what we're talking about is this kind of exciting middle ground where our visual system can extract rich and abstract information. And this is similar to how we recognize information about objects across a lot of different transformations and other concepts that you would think of being as high level, like whether something is alive or not, whether two things are interacting causally, et cetera. And so then the final thing I'll say is that this definition also limits the type of social interactions we're talking about. So what I'm going to be talking about today are all social interactions that occur pretty close in space between at least two people and on a short temporal time scale. So like two people chatting, waving to each other, et cetera. What I'm going to be talking about does not talk about more abstract concepts of an interaction, like if you and a friend were collaborating on a project. But this is still a very rich definition of social interaction. And we talk about two different types. So the first we call these social primitives, which are visual features that are very indicative of a social interaction, but not interactions themselves. So whether two people are close by, are facing, and are moving contingently. And it also encompasses what we've called the core components of a social interaction. So whether two people are interacting physically by doing something like dancing, whether they're communicating, and then the goal compatibility, this kind of helping versus hindering that I showed you in those infant studies before. And so in the first part of the paper, we review a lot of behavioral studies that show that humans have different perceptual signatures that are thought to be significant of visual processing in particular. So first, they're subject to inversion effects. So just like you're much better at recognizing a face when it's upright than inverted, this is also true for pairs of bodies, but not importantly, pairs of bodies that are not facing. So this wonderful work, mostly from Luba Papeo's lab, has shown that humans have all sorts of visual effects. They're faster at recognizing. They can find them in a search display for pairs of bodies that are facing each other when they're upright, but not if you flip them upside down or make them non-facing. Social interactions also receive priority access to conscious perception. So in what's known as the binocular rivalry study, you can present two different stimuli to the two eyes of a participant. So for example, in your left eye, I could show you this red person, and in your right eye, I could show you the blue person. And in both eyes, you would also see a second person that's interacting with one of them, but not the other. So in this case, the green and red people are dancing contingently, but the stimulus in your right eye would not display a social interaction. It would have incoherent interactions. And what you show is that what normally happens is you can't see both of these things at the same time. So what your brain does is it flips between perceiving the information coming from one eye and the other. And what people have found is that if one of these eyes is showing information in a coherent social interaction, you see that much more. Your brain prioritizes that information. And then finally, social interactions are subject to visual adaptation effects. So just like other visual features like color, if I show you the color red over and over and over, and then I show you orange, you're more likely to perceive it as more yellow because your neurons are essentially, your red color perception cells are essentially fatigued. And so you switch in the other way. People have also shown this for social interaction. So if you show pairs of actions like throwing and catching and giving and taking, you get these exact same effects, even for something that seems like so high level. And then in the second part of the paper, we try to outline a neural computational framework for how this happens. And so this is a side view of the human brain. The back side is on the left, the front is on the right. That's my cartoon of an eyeball. If you were looking at a scene like this, which is 3 of my lab members sitting on a couch, we know that you have dedicated brain regions for recognizing people's faces and bodies. This information then gets fed into regions that process these, what we call social primitives, information about whether people are facing or moving contingently. And that information is then passed on in a hierarchy to recognize whether people are interacting. And we argue that all of this happens within the visual system, and it's separate from higher level cognitive thinking, like whether you're thinking about language, decision-making, those sorts of things, which happen in other brain regions. So this is the framework we're kind of operating on, and I'm going to tell you now about 2 studies that we've done in our lab that support this theory. First, maybe I'll pause and ask if there are any questions. All right, so
I do have one quick.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that the adaptiveness, the neurons with the color, for example, that indicates that that processing could possibly be taking place, or does that indicate that that particular processing could be taking place in the retina rather than in the brain region you mentioned? And if that is the case, and you see the same effect for the behavioral or the social aspect, could it be that the social primitive processing could also be taking place in the eye itself rather than in the brain? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, great question. Great point. So the color example I gave could be happening with the cones in your retina. There are also cortical regions that process color, but there are other examples of things that we know are not processed in the retinas, like oriented edges, for example, that we know happen in visual cortex, where you also get similar adaptation effects for. So I don't think this information is so early that it happens in the retina, but I think just a few processing stages after that. So as far as I know, there is no, I don't think there's such early tuning for this information. So color was a very extreme example I gave, maybe. Yeah, thanks for the question. Okay. So the next study I'll talk about is a functional MRI study where we look specifically at the hierarchical processing of this information. So how it could be built up from, pixels, edges, et cetera, information that does happen in the retina in the visual cortex. And this was work led by a PhD student in my lab, Emily McMahon, and it was just published. So the classic view of visual neuroscience, so again, this is a side view of the brain, visual cortex is in the back of your brain. The classic view of visual neuroscience is that information starts in early visual cortex, and it's processed along 2 distinct pathways. The ventral pathway shown here in green, which is sometimes referred to as the what or object recognition pathway, and the dorsal pathway in blue, which is sometimes referred to as the where or how pathway, which is thought to recognize objects where they are in space and how people guide how you interact with them. Very recently, people have started proposing that there might actually be a 3rd visual pathway that extends along the lateral or side of the brain in regions known as the superior temporal sulcus, or STS. And people have postulated that this pathway is organized hierarchically, similar to other visual pathways. So, for example, in the ventral or object recognition pathway, we know that there is hierarchical processing. So in the earliest layers, which is in the back of the brain, low-level features, there are cells that are tuned to low-level features like oriented edges or Gabor patches. In subsequent mid-level areas, there are slightly larger neurons with slightly larger windows or receptive fields that process slightly more complex features. And as you move further along in the processing, information gets more abstract and high level. And in fact, these hierarchies were really the inspiration for the earliest convolutional neural networks, right? So this pathway is also known to be hierarchical and convolutional. And so we wanted to ask whether the features of social scenes are processed in a similar hierarchical manner. And so this, the original work postulated that you would have information start in early visual cortex, go to a region called MT that's known to be motion selective, and then these regions in the STS that are known to process dynamic social features. In our work, we also wanted to investigate some other known regions. So this area called the extrastriate body area, that's known to respond when people view bodies, but not just single bodies. Recently, work has shown that it also is tuned to pairs of bodies. And then a region called LOC that is known to recognize object information in particular, and recently has also been shown to recognize relevant scene information also. And so in order to comprehensively test regions that respond to a whole bunch of different things, we wanted to sample many different visual and social features. So we made a stimulus set that consisted of short 3-second video clips, each one having 2 people in it. And despite the fact that they all have 2 people, they actually vary quite a bit in their social content, from ones that are not really social at all to ones that are highly social and communicative. And so in total, we made a video set of 250 of these 2-person videos and played them to participants in an fMRI experiment without sound. We also labeled the videos with each of those features I mentioned. So whether the scene took place indoor or outdoor, the spatial expanse of the scene, whether it was a close-up or far away scene, and whether somebody was interacting with an object. These social primitive features I mentioned, so whether people were close together and facing. The 2 different types of social interaction I mentioned, so whether people are engaged in a joint or physical interaction like dancing, and whether they're communicating. And then emotional features, valence and arousal. And so in the real world, many of these are correlated. So if 2 people are close together, they're often also communicating. But and you couldn't remove all of these correlations without having a totally unnatural looking stimulus set. But to the best of our abilities, we tried to make sure that they were minimally correlated. We also extracted low-level visual features from the second convolutional layer of AlexNet, as well as the motion energy features. And we did what's known as a condition-rich fMRI design. So we only had a few participants, but we showed them these videos lots of times. So over multiple scan sessions that added up to 8 hours total in the fMRI scanner. And so as a result, you get very good quality data in individual subjects. So this is the split half reliability of our data. Just you take the response to the half the presentations of the images and correlate it with the other half. And you can think of it like the test retest reliability. And this is very high for fMRI data. And in particular, it was very high along these regions in the STS that we were so interested in sampling. And this is in contrast to other large-scale fMRI data sets, which only sample from static images and therefore don't really capture reliable data along these regions. And so to analyze this data, we use what's known as an encoding model, but it's essentially just a linear regression where you have all the videos, we have the features we labeled, and then for every voxel, which is the unit of measure in our fMRI, we learn a set of linear mappings that relates the videos to the brain features to the brain activity. And then in a new held out set of fMRI data, a set of videos, we can predict responses to those videos and compare them to actual responses. And we can use this correlation as a measure for how well our model works. Okay, so here's the reliability and here's our performance. And what we can also look at this in the different, so these are whole brain results I'm showing you. for the left and right hemisphere. We can also look at results in those specific regions that I mentioned. And we can see that in each region, the purple bar is the model performance and the gray bar is the level of the noise ceiling. You can see that we can significantly predict brain responses in every region of interest along our pathway, almost at the level of the noise ceiling in many of them. Okay, but that's using all of our features in the full model that we label. But ultimately, what we want to understand is how these different features are represented. So what we can do instead is we can do variance partitioning to look at the unique variance, say, for example, explained only by these social features. We can fit an encoding model with all of the features minus that feature of interest and take the difference, and that'll give us the unique variance explained by each feature. So now we can turn to looking at how the different groups of features explain responses in these regions. So starting with our two earliest regions that are known to be involved in low-level visual and motion processing, we nicely confirm these results. So they're most well predicted by the motion energy of the videos. Now we can turn to the more mid-level regions. And we see that they're predicted by motion, but also this one in particular is well predicted by these mid-level features that we called. So whether in particular, an action is directed at an object and these social primitives, like how close the people are to each other. And then we can go to our two highest level regions in the STS. And we see that the only feature that is uniquely predictive of responses in these regions is the social interaction features. And one thing you see is that as you go further along this pathway, you get selectivity to more and more abstract features, just like you would, we hypothesize based on the hierarchy. So those were the results in the particular regions. We can look at a whole brain map as well in one subject. We did this for all our subjects. They look very similar. And it's a little messy. That's what neuroimaging data often looks like. But you can still see the broad patterns I'm mentioning come out even when you look at the entire brain. So that result was grouping all of these features together. So taking all the scene and object features, all the social primitive features, et cetera. Instead, we can look at the individual features. So how well does communication predict responses, for example? When we do that, we only find two features that explain unique variance when controlling for all other features, which makes sense. It's a pretty high bar to clear to have communication explain variance when you remove the effect variance explained by all these other features. And those two are object directedness. So whether somebody's interacting with an object, which happens in these regions in LOTC and actually was really nicely confirmatory of prior studies with smaller scale experiments. And then most interestingly and novelly, we found that the feature actually that explained the most unique variance and the most voxels was whether people were watching a communicative event. And again, I'm controlling for how close the people are together, whether they're physically interacting, all these other information that we know is also important. And we were pretty surprised by this. There's no sound in these videos, so it's also not hearing people talk or anything like that. It seems to actually be something about the visual signatures that happen when you watch people communicate. And so this really suggests that despite the behavioral evidence showing that all of these are important, the feature that's most prioritized in the brain, at least in our hands, is really these communicative interactions. And so we found that these representations for social action along the lateral visual pathway become increasingly abstract as you move from low to high level regions. And that recognizing communicative actions in particular might be one of the key goals of this pathway. So these pathways have been hypothesized to be involved in dynamic social processing generally, and we think this kind of helps narrow in on what exactly these regions care most about. However, while I showed you that the information becomes increasingly abstract, that doesn't necessarily actually mean it's happening in a hierarchical fashion. And so these are things that we're trying to get into in some future work. One is using EEG data, which has much better temporal resolution than fMRI. With functional MRI, you only get a different new picture of the brain every 2 seconds. So it's hard to understand how neural processing progresses through these regions. But one thing we've shown in other stimuli is if you combine, if you run EEG with the same stimuli, you can combine it with your fMRI data and actually get a millisecond by millisecond time course of how information evolves through different regions. One thing we're also looking at is in deep neural networks, whether they recapitulate the same hierarchy as these regions. So people have found this for object recognition, but have never really demonstrated it for these more dynamic social stimuli. And so this is work being led by several students in my lab. And they took 300 off-the-shelf deep neural networks of all sorts, convolutional, transformer, hybrid models, mixer models, et cetera. And one sort of interesting thing that's recently been found with object recognition is that despite the fact that these networks have drastically different architectures, some that are brain-like, some that are not at all brain-like, they all seem to learn representations that match the brain, which is strange. But we find something similar. I'm happy to chat about that more in the Q&A if people want. I don't think we really know why is the summary, but we find something similar here. So the other thing people have found with object recognition is that as you go from early brain regions in the x-axis on the left to the right, you find that the depth of the best fitting layer in the neural network also increases. So early regions are best predicted by early network layers and high-level brain regions by late network layers. And we see a similar trend here. So as you move further forward along this pathway, the best fitting deep neural network layer tends to be deeper and deeper. And also, it doesn't seem to really matter what type of network you're looking at. They all work kind of similarly. However, one difference between these data and what other people have shown with static object recognition is that the fit to the brain data, so the correlation between the brain responses and the deep neural network responses to these videos is not great. It starts out high in early visual regions, but as you move along this pathway, it gets lower and lower. And this is in contrast to those regions in the ventral stream that do object recognition that I talked about before, which are quite well matched by these networks. And so, while I think this is nice evidence for hierarchical processing, I think they point to a hole in, the deep networks that probably has to do with dynamics, but it's something we're actively looking at. All right. So in the last part of my talk, I'm going to discuss another aspect of social interactions. So the fact that they are inherently relational, and talk about some graph neural network models that we designed to help recognize them, to improve on these kind of more standard off-the-shelf neural network models. All right, so going back to this hill climbing example that I mentioned, where infants can recognize that this triangle is helping this red circle. And probably all of you can recognize that too. There are two schools of thought for how the brain is making sense of this image. The first is often modeled with what are known as generative inverse planning models that extract the agents and actually generate potential hypotheses about what could be happening. So for example, you could imagine the red circles trying to go up the hill and the yellow triangle could help or hinder. And then these models use try to simulate what possible trajectories would look like under each of these hypotheses. And these are based on a generative model of the world that's often instantiated in a Bayesian generative model and physics simulator. But it involves a lot of explicit knowledge about the world, right? So you have to know what agents do, what they might move like, et cetera, et cetera. And this is actually in contrast with a lot of the work I showed you before that suggests that humans just quickly visually recognize this information. And so then they recognize the true trajectory by comparing their simulations with the observed trajectory, and they use that to make a prediction. And so up to this point, these were actually the best models that we had of this ability. And so people mostly believed that humans use kind of similar processes of complex mental simulation to recognize the interactions. So there are some problems. One, as I mentioned, it is not compatible with the hypotheses I laid out in the beginning. But two, these models are also very computationally expensive to run and only work in these limited domains where you have a physics simulator of the world and possible actions agents may take, right? So even if you added 3D information or a third agent or something even slightly more complex, the search space of these models blows up and it's very difficult to keep them computationally tractable. Okay, and these models are in contrast to these more purely visual bottom-up models, like a neural network, for example. However, like I just showed you with the neural data and also behaviorally, these neural network models don't do a good job of recognizing this sort of information. And so this sort of led to a puzzle about whether purely visual information and models that use this are enough to explain social interaction judgments. But one, I think, key insight that I mentioned is that these interactions are inherently relational. And so we wanted to ask if a visual model with relational inductive biases could do a better job of modeling human judgments. And this was work led by my another PhD student, Manasi Malik. All right, so inductive biases are built-in knowledge or that a model can use to generalize, and they're inspired by human cognition, right? And the idea that humans have structured representations that allow us to recognize objects, their relative position, etc. And so they're largely lacking in most deep neural networks, but not completely, right? So the convolution is a type of inductive bias, the idea that the same feature could appear at many positions in your visual field. And it's one that's inspired by human neuroscience. And so another type here that we're going to talk about is the idea of graph structure, right? So going back to that circle triangle example, you could have these two agents, agent 1 and agent 2. You can get a bunch of visual features about them, concatenate them, and pass it through a standard neural network and make a prediction, like help or hinder. Like I said, this doesn't work very well. But instead, what you can do is you can formulate these two agents as nodes in a graph and also learn to represent the edges between them. And then you could feed this simple graph or even a more complex graph into a neural network and make the prediction. And so this is a graph neural network. We combined a graph neural network with a recurrent neural network to help us make predictions in these videos that extend over time and predict whether a scene contained a positive or negative social interaction. We call this model social GNN. And so this model was inspired by a growing body of graph neural networks, but I'll talk about some key differences in a little bit. And so to evaluate this model, we use this really great data set from Josh Tenenbaum's lab at MIT, where they used a simulator to, they created a world, different worlds, where there are always two agents, this red and green guy, and two objects, this pink and blue ball, and then different layouts of walls that the agents cannot pass through, goals, objectives. And so here's an example of one of these videos. And so the videos always contain the two agents that have a social and physical goal, having some sort of interaction. And the interaction can be either friendly, adversarial, or neutral. And so the simulator has a ground truth. It created this video. In this case, this was created as an adversarial example. But you can probably see that they're somewhat ambiguous, actually, which is kind of nice. So the first thing we did was get a bunch of human ratings online for these different videos. So we told participants in an online experiment, you're going to see these two creatures and these two objects. These are landmarks and these are walls. And then they would watch a video, and for every video they'd rate, was this adversarial, neutral, or friendly. For the most part, people agreed pretty well. Their agreement was about 80%. So it was high, but not perfect. And the reason we got these human ratings is even though the data set has ground truth labels, this data set is called phase, by the way. So even though it has ground truth labels, we really wanted to know what humans do with the videos. And so just to walk you through that, if the video was rendered as a friendly video, most humans agreed with that. This is a confusion matrix showing the human ratings versus the ground truth labels. Similarly, if it was an adversarial video, humans agreed with that too. But the first finding that we thought was quite interesting is that if it was rendered to be a neutral video, that means that the two agents were not supposed to be interacting with each other. People often didn't call it neutral. So this replicates prior findings that humans like to attribute social intention to agents that they see. So even though the video was intended to was rendered as neutral, which means the two agents had separate goals, people still often rated those as either being friendly or adversarial, which was interesting. And so going forward, we use the mode of the human ratings to train our neural network and evaluate both models. All right. So the first thing we had to do was extract graphs from these videos. So we had node information about every agent and object, which included its position, velocity, angle, and size. And at every frame, we could put those nodes in a graph where the edges were based on whether any two entities were in contact. So in this frame, you're seeing the red agent is touching the blue ball. So there's an edge between red and blue, the green agent as well. And importantly, all of this information can be extracted visually based on visual features. And it's fed frame by frame into our graph neural network. And so at each time step, we put in the input graph, and it goes through temporal processing that's very essentially an LSTM, or very standard recurrent neural network that operates on the graph. And I'll talk about the graph processing in a second. And so then at the final time step, the model makes a classification about whether it was a friendly, neutral, or adversarial video. So at each time step, how we do the graph processing is for every edge. So for example, this edge, we take the two nodes on either side of the edge. So in this case, the green agent and blue agent, and just concatenate their node information. And in that way, we make a list of all the edges. So the next edge would be this red and blue agent. We pass that through a linear layer, and that is the input graph that gets sent into the RNN. So then at the final time step, we directly classify from the graph whether it was a friendly, neutral, or adversarial interaction. So this is the way that this model is different than most graph neural networks. So there are a lot of graph neural networks that do trajectory prediction, including on problems like this. So it would take in the information and try to predict the next frame, and then use that trajectory prediction as an intermediate representation to learn the type of interaction. But humans actually, we believe, make this information directly from the graph itself, the structure of the agents and objects. And so that's why we designed the graph this way. We compared this to two baseline models, one that is takes all the same input information, but just in an ordered list, passes in all the node features into a recurrent neural network that gets the same input information as the same network size, same structure, makes a linear classification at the end. We call this model visual RNN. And then that inverse planning model that I mentioned before that uses the simulations from the physics simulator and was the prior state of the art when this data set was released. Okay. So like I said, humans agree on these videos about 80% of the time. The prior state of the art, the generative inverse planning model, gets almost there. It's significantly better than the visual model, which had been shown before. However, now our model does quite well. It's even just this small tweak raises it to the level of human agreement. This data set also had a separate generalization set that was held out that had 100 videos with totally novel scene and action types that were not seen in the training set. And so in this case, actually, these sorts of problems are where these generative models do very well. They're good at generalizing to totally unseen scenarios. And in this case, it does slightly better than our model, but it comes at a huge computational cost. So both in terms of runtime and memory, it's like many orders of magnitude larger than either of the neural networks. And so we think this graph structure is a nice way to get a quick and flexible model that works pretty well in most scenarios. Further, if you look not just at the absolute accuracy, but how well it matches the pattern of errors and level of human agreement, the two models now do exactly the same, both at their overall correlation with behavior and also their correlation when you remove the effect of the other model. And then finally, the nice thing about these models is that they can operate on natural videos. So we had another data set called the human gaze communication data set that consisted of 1 to 4 people interacting with objects. And you can do this exact same thing. You can get bounding boxes around the people and objects, feed those into and use those as node features in your graph neural network. Here, the inverse planning model does not work because it doesn't operate on these complex scenarios. But you can try kind of a standard frame-by-frame convolutional neural network. It does not do well. The visual model does a little better, and our model does quite a bit better. So in sum, we found that a purely visual model with this relational inductive bias can reproduce human judgments on social scenes. And it doesn't have to have explicit representations of agents' goals or the physical world, suggesting that humans don't need this information either. But importantly, having this structured graph information was really important, and we think might be something that humans use as well. So in sum, I told you some evidence that social interactions are recognized within the human visual system, processed hierarchically in a new visual pathway, and well modeled by structured visual computations. Ongoing work in our lab is trying to actually compare these graph neural networks to brain data, as well as those more inverse planning models to try to get an idea of how these more perceptual versus cognitive computations are happening in the brain. And so with that, I would like to thank my lab, especially Emily and Manasi, who did the work that I talked about today. You can find information on our website, and I am happy to take any questions. There's a little bit more time.
First, let us thank the speaker for a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
If there are any questions, you can speak up, unmute and speak, or put it on the chat.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead and ask a question.
Okay, I'm a sociologist, and I find it your talk quite fascinating. I'm wondering if you've read.
You got muted at some point.
Last century, George Herbert Mead at the University of Chicago, and he wrote about, he's sort of the central figure in social psychology in what we call symbolic interactionism. And he has a little book, it's called Mind, Self, and Society. And it talks about taking the role of the other. And anyway, I just wondered if you read or consider any social science in your work. And I commend George Herbert Mead as just someone that addressed the issues that you're talking about, but certainly not with the machinery and I guess conceptual framework that you have available to you and through the computer.
Yeah, thank you. I'm not familiar with his work, but I will have to note it. I'm very inspired by both social and developmental psychology in terms of what to look for, because I think the things that people have found are important organizing classes for us when we think about these topics are likely candidates to find in the brain. So I draw a lot of inspiration from that work, but I'm not familiar with his work. So I will, I've made a note now, but thank you.
Okay, I guess I have a question. This is with your phase stimuli.
Yeah.
And you broke it down into, with your confusion matrix, you had friendly, neutral, and adversary.
Yeah.
What would happen if you kind of had more labels? What instead of 3 labels, what would happen if you had 5?
Yeah. Great question. Okay, so in that data set, and we haven't looked at this yet, they actually also had people just give free responses, like, what do you think these 2 shapes are doing? And they found that people converged on actually like 11-ish labels. For kind of uninteresting practical reasons, like there weren't enough examples of each one, we didn't use those, but I think it would be very interesting. For the second one, I didn't show you, let's see if I have slides on this. No. Okay. For these natural videos, we have the results I showed you were for predicting whether the people were interacting or not. But actually, this data set has 5 different distinct types of gaze communication. So mutual gaze if the 2 people are looking at each other, joint attention if they're looking at the same thing, not interacting, like, anyway, there are 5 different types. And we can predict them above chance, but not as well as we do with the binary classification, obviously, or as we do it in the phase data set. And so there's definitely room for improvement, but I think the thing we really tried to focus on, I think that improvement is going to come from engineering better node features. So here we used a kind of off-the-shelf algorithms to get bounding boxes and neural network features from these entities. But I think the thing we really focused on was like the huge jump you get from just taking these exact same features and structuring them in a graph. And so I think better engineering here of these visual features will allow us to do even better in these more fine-grained classifications, but it's something we still need to look into. It's a good question.
I found your design of the graph neural network architecture and processing, and the fact that practically replicated human level performance quite fascinating. And the one question I have is, you mentioned that in human judgments, humans tended to attribute a relationship, friendly or adversarial, even to neutral interactions. Did you see that replicated in the neural network?
Yes, although, yes, it did. So I don't think I have them here, but we do have the confusion matrices for the neural network in the paper, and it shows a similar trend to mostly classify things as friendly and adversarial. Importantly, though, we used separate sets, but we use some of that human data to train the network, right? So in some ways, it learns those human biases as well.
Okay.
But
and a totally unrelated question is, when humans are making judgments such as, say, just from visual dynamic visual stimuli without sound, that say 2 people are communicating, do you think it's possible that high-level judgments can be sort of decomposed into the detection of a finite small set of social primitives, such as facingness, maybe the presence of hand gestures, or if it is a close-up, the movement of the lips and things of that sort? And if so, do you think it's possible to describe or characterize other high-level decisions about or inferences about social interactions based on smaller sets of primitives that are associated with those decisions?
Yeah, great question. I think for several key interactions, yes. We didn't make a strong claim on this, but my conjecture is that it has to do with ones that are more evolutionarily and developmentally important that will be possible, because those are the ones that evolutionarily we have to recognize quickly. So it makes sense that there is a set of visual features that they exist for. This is mostly conjecture right now. And I think that that said, there's a limit to where that can happen, right? So this is a social interaction you and I are having on Zoom. We're talking about my very high level talk, right? That our somebody else's visual system cannot fully understand this interaction. But I think a lot of what our research is trying to do, I think the boundary of what our visual system can do is just much farther than what people typically think. And so a lot of what we try to do is understand how far we can push that boundary. But that said, there are several aspects of recognizing and understanding social interaction that and are in our own social interactions ourselves that I acknowledge just don't fall in that. And I think the most obvious examples have to do with language and also theory of mind. So how we think about other people's mental states. So I think those are things that mostly that go beyond our visual system and are critical for real world social interaction. We have some other work trying to look in, like when people watch movies, at how those different processes interact. Because I think that's a really important next direction that we're trying to look at in the lab.
Are there any other questions from Zoom or from the seminar room? In that case, thank you once again for a very interesting talk. And
thank you so much for having me and for the wonderful questions. I really enjoyed it.
And I certainly look forward to reading your papers, which I wasn't aware of beforehand. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye.